Listen to the rumble. Listen to the roar. Slowly in 3. They'll be flying off 4. Watch them now.
Welcome to the Vintage Racing Podcast, Episode 8. The date was Saturday, April 27th, 2019, and I traveled to Indianapolis, Indiana to drop off Bobby Green's Eastwood Special. The Eastwood Special is a 1938 Ascot-style sprint car with a 220 Miller four-cylinder in it. I found that car back about 2 years ago. It was hiding in a collection of Norm Anderson up in Northeast Ohio. Bobby, I called Bobby. It was a California car, and Norm wanted the car to go to someone that would run it and get it out and exercise it. So called Bobby and said, hey, this is a California car. You really ought to get this thing. It's beautiful. And Bobby bought it and then had me go through it, get the Miller running, put an onboard starter on it, and then we took it and raced it at the Race of Gentlemen. We ran it at the Miller meet and took it to 2 or 3 different events and had a blast with it last summer. Last week when I was out in California, Bobby mentioned that he had a truck and trailer coming to Indianapolis with room for an extra car. So we decided it was time for the Eastwood Special to go back home where it was originally built by legendary race car restorer Pete Eastwood. Pete Eastwood lives very close to Bobby, so the car's really truly going home. It's pretty cool. Knowing I would be in Indy on Saturday, I called my childhood friend Joey Kerr and asked him if he would see if Steve Stapp would sit down with me for a chat on the podcast. Bopper, as most people call him, he's been on my list from the first rough draft of a podcast list of guys I want to talk to. I'm very, very honored and fortunate to call Bopper a friend, and but still respect a legend like that enough to just kind of go through Joey and say, is this cool? I'd really like to do this. So, of course, Bopper was happy to and gave me shit for not calling him directly. So, once we were set up, I met up with Josh Sorum from California. He was bringing the other truck and trailer out, and he had on his truck and trailer Babe Stapp's 1934 Roadster that was ran in the Mine Field races. It's a replica of the original car. None of the original cars still exist. There's replicas of them out there. And I wanted Bopper to meet us there so he could see that car. And it was really special. Him and Rosemary, his wife Rosemary, who's just awesome, she showed up and she really understood it. The first thing she said was, I just touched the steering wheel that my father-in-law touched. So that was cool. She really understood it. They checked the car out. We got some pictures of Steve Stapp and his daughter Susanna, which is Babe Stapp's granddaughter, sitting in a race car. And it was a cool transition and got to see, some history be made. Then we wrapped it up and went into Joey Kerr's shop and we set up the podcast. And Steve Stapp began telling his family's racing legacy's story from the beginning, starting with his dad, Babe Stapp, a 12-time Indianapolis 500 running driver. This guy was a stud. The whole family was. Their history in American racing is on the top shelf, and you will see by the wild ride of stories you're about to hear that they did it all, and they did it in fine style. So kick back and enjoy it. This is American racing families at its best. One more quick note. Please excuse the sound on this particular podcast for the first 10-15 minutes. I didn't have my tech advisor, Cameron, with me to keep me on track, and you can't win every feature, of course. And Bopper and I both are old racers and can't hear worth a shit, so I have everything cranked up high so we can hear ourselves through the headphones, and the first 10-15% of the podcast is cranked up pretty loud and a little staticky. Just bear with me, and we'll get this figured out. We're still new at everything, so we're doing our best here. Thank you. Where I'm going to start with you, Steve. I call you Steve like I know you. I feel like saying Mr. Stapp.
No, you don't say Mr. Stapp. It's Steve or the Bopper.
First off, when did the nickname Bopper come about? How early?
That came when we were racing at Richmond, and Irish and Louis Seymour, Irish with Hoosier, all of a sudden they yelled at me, "Hey, Big Bopper!" And I turned around, and it was stuck from then on. And that's been, it's been at least more than 20 years. And then everybody just started calling me the Bopper, after
That's
that.
what I always knew you as.
Yeah.
I'm going to go way back, and I want to start with your dad.
Okay.
Babe Stapp.
Right.
Very, very well-known, famous American race car driver from California. Was your dad born in California?
No, he was born in San Antonio, Texas.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Cool. That very cool. Mm-hmm. My wife and I went on our honeymoon in Texas, and we just went around Texas.
Yeah.
And San Antonio was our favorite town.
Really?
Oh,
Okay.
by far. I mean, we went to Austin and everywhere, and we just liked that.
I'd figure Austin would be the
It was too hip now.
Is it?
Yeah, I mean, 5 years ago, it probably would have been perfect. But it was really cool. I shouldn't say that, but just San Antonio, we had more fun. It was a lot of history. I liked it.
Well, in 1946, in 1947, 48, and 50, or 49, my dad promoted Arlington Downs, which was a track right between Fort Worth and Dallas.
Okay.
It was a mile dirt horse track. And my dad in 50 promoted Del Mar in California, and that's when Rex Mays got killed.
Yes.
And it bothered him so much that he just decided not to do it anymore.
Really?
Went off.
Now, the owner, the car that ran over Rex was Hal Cole's Blue Curtis number 14. The only way I know that is I restored that car, and Hal Cole hung it up that day too, from what I've read. It bothered him as well.
I don't, what I was always under the impression was told is Jimmy Davies ran over it in a
right.
six-wheeler.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Okay. Yeah, I would trust you way more than me.
Well, I know because my memory isn't that good. The old parts of my memory, a lot of things I remember, but today
that would make
and stuff
sense.
like that. But it was the six-wheeler, and it was Jimmy Davies,
Okay.
and he won the race.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And my mom and dad left me at the racetrack with my grandmother, and they went to the hospital with Rex and his wife.
Well, your dad, to race, I mean, we're talking in 20s and 30s here, did he start off, it's the Depression. It's one of the poorest times in the country. Did he start off with a little money? Did he get sponsored? How did he get into racing on the level he did?
He started in 1926.
Okay.
And he started by just getting a ride. He had no money, and he had no job. But I don't know what he drove or what he did for people to see him to get a ride.
Yeah.
And then he used to tell me that during the Depression was the best time. He had the most money during the Depression because nobody had a job, and so they would either go to bars or they went to the races because that's the only two things they had to go to.
Get your mind off it.
Yeah, and they would pack the old Ascot. I mean the hills would have people on them. It'd be completely and totally packed. And I believe he told me that it was like 50 cents to get in, and they had big crowds and big purses and all.
That's one of the things I want to talk to you about is racing in that era. And the reason I asked how he got started was we're talking it's so far back that it's before you could come from a racing family. He's ground zero.
Right.
He's right there in the beginning.
And his family was not a racing family. His dad was an engineer on buildings and structures and stuff like that. So he had nothing to do with racing.
Very cool. When I study Miller race cars and Harry Miller, Babe Stapp's name comes up. He was driving those cars, which would have been the equivalent of Penske rides today, top level stuff. When he got to the level where he was racing in AAA on the championship circuit in Indianapolis, how many trips to Indy did he make? What was his record back then?
And he only missed one race between 26 and 41 at the Speedway, and he missed that because he crashed at Ascot and got hurt at Ascot and wasn't. I believe he had a broken leg or something and couldn't run the Speedway, and that's the only one that he didn't run in that length of time.
What was his first year then going to the Speedway? 26. Did he? Do you remember any stories about his first time there? Trying to get.
I don't, because we talked about it a lot, but I was just a kid, and, and I didn't. We talked more about him helping me with my race cars.
That makes sense.
Then people would come and talk to him, and I'd listen to all the things they'd talk about and all. But he was my main mentor when it came to starting out. When I was, Johnny Parsons gave me a frame when I was 14 years old, and when I turned 16, just a little over 16, Leroy Neumeier drove it, and we went to the racetrack, and I didn't even have a driver's license. I had to get somebody to drive the car to go there, and at 10 I was doing the scoreboard for Agaginian, so I could sneak down the pits and talk to guys. And at that time my dad was an official, but during the week he took care of the car for Ernie Serdo that George Amick drove. So George would be at the house, all kinds of guys would be there, and then Rex Mays' shop was just down the street from the school that I went to, and I could go over there and see guys and everything else. So it was
the hangout.
Yeah, it was Glendale was where
I was going to ask you that.
Right, and but my dad had he had that Miller in the garage at home that he never finished, and it sat there, and we moved, and then I believe he sold it to somebody. I don't really know what happened to it.
What was his best finish at Indy?
5th and a 6th.
Wow!
And they started until Donald Davidson knows when it was, because it's been probably 12 years, maybe even 15, he was still in the top 10 as lap leaders. And at one time he was number 1 as lap leaders, and he fell out of races leading them at 96 laps.
Oh, man.
And he fell out of a lot of races with car problems and stuff like that. So
last week I was out in California and with Bobby Green, and he got to take me to a lot of the places. We went to Glendale and saw where Curtis's shop was, and we got to see it where, and Ed Justice helped.
Right.
He's a friend, and he was showing me where shops were. And Bobby Green has basically it's a photo album, but it's a scrapbook for your dad, and it's got a lot of really amazing stuff in it. And
that's what he said when I met him.
I'm going to get that to you. I want to show it to you. And there's a bunch of pencil drawings in there. And whoever was drawing them, they were drawing designs for a thing called the 13 Black Cats. And it was an idea. You can tell they were sketching this out. They had a logo, and they had a list of 13 guys, and Frank Lockhart was on there. And it was a stunt and thrill show. And they have a drawing of a plane with a ladder hanging down and a bicycle. And it was a thrill show. And the slogan was, if the Black Cats can't do it, it can't be done. And your dad was in there.
Yeah, I saw that.
Now, was he a thrill seeker?
He did things like that that he just enjoyed doing.
Yeah.
And that's what when I was born, he had told my mom that when I was born he was going to quit racing because he didn't want somebody else raising me, that it was his responsibility to do it and all. And my mom was having me, and they brought him into the hospital, and he had started a midget on an alley behind the house, and going down the alley, and the brakes didn't work, and when the brakes didn't work, it crashed, and it caught on fire, and they didn't think he was going to make it. He was burned so bad.
Wow.
And so he was in one room, and they were telling her that they didn't think he was going to make it, and she was having me.
Oh, man.
He made it, and he quit. And then when I got to the point when Andy was born, I decided the year after he was born, that 2 years after that I was going to do the same thing, because I had one responsibility then, and then Susanna came along, and I figured you're supposed to raise your kids and do that. So,
well, before I get to your racing, I want to touch on one thing you mentioned. Racing in that time, a lot of people don't understand how auto racing in that era was bigger than football, NFL, baseball, anything we know today. It was the sport of America.
Right.
And it was what you did. There was no TV. There was no internet. That was what you did as a family. If the races came to town, the town went to the racetrack.
Right. And they ran the fairgrounds all over, little fair tracks and everything like that. And he won a race at Charlotte, North Carolina, back in 32, I think it was, and that race at that time paid $32,000.
Oh my gosh!
To win.
In 32.
In 32, yeah. He won quite a few other races, and in those days, like on the board tracks and stuff, there wasn't anything to do, so people went, and they had big purses. They paid a lot of money.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it is.
That's amazing. In Cincinnati, there was a 2-mile board track. And if you do the research into history, their opening day in 1916 had 62,000 people at it, and it's still to date the biggest one-day sporting event in Cincinnati history.
Is that right?
And I love that.
Yeah.
Because now all they talk about is the Bengals and the Reds and the baseball and the football.
Right.
And auto racing still has the biggest crowd in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
And I like that.
Yeah.
And Indianapolis obviously was the Mecca, and that race is world-renowned, one of the biggest any kind of sports events in the world. Did your dad, your family, you guys stayed in California the whole time he was racing out west? Did you relocate to Indianapolis?
Okay, when he was racing, I wasn't born.
Okay.
But my mom and my dad would go back to California in the wintertime, and then they'd come back to the Speedway, and then they'd race all over back here and all over the country, and then go back to California in the wintertime.
Was he one of the drivers that would have a garage at the Speedway?
Whoever he was driving for would have a garage at the Speedway.
Yeah, and that makes sense.
Yeah, and because he didn't mechanic the cars, when he drove for oh man, there were two brothers that had Indy cars at the Speedway. They were of that era that you were talking about. And it wasn't. This is what's bad. The Stutz is right downtown where they were there, and he did drive for Stutz, but then he drove for
Duran. Those guys were in that era.
Yeah, the two that I'm. Oh my gosh. I'll think of it.
No problem.
But no, it wasn't Boyle. It was, they built the cars, and their cars they built street cars, plus they had the race cars.
Duesenberg?
Duesenberg.
Augie Duesenberg and his brother. As soon as you said street cars, that was it.
And my dad would work on the race cars there in the building.
Wow.
During the daytime and all that. And he told me one time, one night, it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and Augie said, "All right, boys," he said, "we've had a good day today." He says, "We've gotten a lot done. We've really put in a hard day." He said, "Now, you guys all go home and get a good night's sleep, and we'll see you back here at 6 in the morning." And that's the way it was.
That was it.
And then on the Circle, downtown Indianapolis right now, on Capitol, on west of the Circle, on the left-hand side is a garage that's a parking garage. And that parking garage, back in those days, there were race car teams in there. And at Duesenberg, the only way they could get the cars up to the second floor was to put them on an elevator and take them up to the second floor.
Oh, that's cool.
But he would tell me about, in the wintertime, he said your cars were totally black because they used ashes to put on the snow and the ice.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of salt and all, they used ashes out that they'd burn in stoves and all. So
you mentioned you got a midget chassis given to you when you were 14, and I'm sure you eventually drove that car. What was your first racing experiences?
Well, my first racing experiences was on the dry lakes in California, because when I got the first midget that midget, and then the V8 60, because URA was only V8 60s.
Okay.
And we had put an offie in that car after, in 1956, we had put an offie into it. In 56 early, we had a V8 60. Well, I got another car where a guy got hurt bad in, and he was a friend of mine, and I got that one and fixed it up. And it was 1957 that I drove my first race that was actually a race that was a legal race and all, because my mom and dad signed a paper that they wouldn't, sue them if I got hurt or something like that. And it was a midget, and it was a yellow number 57 that I drove. And before that, I ran. We'd go places, and I couldn't run BCRA because they had a 21-year-old rule too.
Wow.
And so we'd go to Lockheed on the weekends when nobody was there, and we'd practice around in the parking lot around the telephone poles with them to get the cars set up to go to Oakland and San Francisco to the Cow Palace to run the midgets then. And I turned 17 in August of 57, but that was in the winter of 57 that we went up there and ran that. And but California was neat because you didn't have bad weather in the wintertime, so you could go do things. And one of the things I tell people that was neat was you could go up to Baldy or one of the ski resorts in the morning up above San Bernardino and different places, and go play in the snow. Then you could go to the beach in the afternoon and go swimming. So it was, it was a really a neat thing.
Is so
and
cool.
There were out there, you'd have. I can remember when we only had 20 days of rain in a year.
Wow.
And so you didn't, it wasn't a deal where you got rained out at the races, and or you had to fight that stuff. And,
when did you? How long was it before you got into a sprint car or a bigger car?
My first sprint car I got into in 1959. And I bought the Henry and James car, which had a inline straight GMC into it.
Yeah.
And it was a very famous car. Billy Cantrell, Hogle, just about everybody around drove it. And I got that, and we had the midget, and we went to Fresno on a Friday night, and a guy spun, and I hit him, and I flipped up over the fence into the grandstand. And I had a real bad concussion, but we went up to Sacramento at a friend's shop and repaired the midget, and then he finished repairing it, and Walt Reef was his name, and he took it to San Jose, and we went to Vacaville, California, and ran the sprint car that next day, practice out there. And then we went, and Steve Searock and I drove it at San Jose, and my head hurt so bad I couldn't stand it. Wow. And he got tired, and I couldn't stand driving it. And on Saturday when I was practicing, I went in a corner and I went in too hard, and Vacaville was a 1.125 paved racetrack, and most people started out on a quarter mile.
Yeah, that's
midget.
A fast place.
Yeah, it was very fast. And there was the guy that won the race had a champ car with an offie into it. I mean, he had them outclassed, but I mean, there was a lot of pavement cars there and stuff that were special, and I didn't know it, but all I had were some recaps, and we ran the recaps onto it, and you'd go down a straightaway, and it would shake so hard you thought you had a 1022 tire in your hands with the steering wheel and vibrate so much. But I got in too hard and went off the track, ran through a field of artichokes and hit a irrigation ditch and bounced over it and came to a stop. And what happened that really hurt was I had the hood held down with springs, and the hood raised up, and then the air caught it in the front and brought it back, and it hit me right across the forehead, where the night before in the midget, I kept telling the doctor that my forehead hurt, and I said, and my head hurts, and he says, well, they'd taken my helmet off, and the doctor says, well, I can fix your forehead right now, but he said, you've got a concussion, because I wasn't real sure of things that he asked me. And I was sitting there, and he said, now on 3, he says, this is going to hurt, but he said, on 3, he said, I'm going to make the hurt go away. And I said, okay. And he went 1, 2, and then he jerked. And in those days, your goggles just went inside a rubber rubber ring, and there was nothing holding them in except 2 straps. And when I flipped, somehow it hit, and it went up underneath, right at my eyebrows, underneath my forehead, clear up underneath my scalp on my head. Wow. And that was what was hurting. And then I found out what it really hurt when he jerked it out of there afterwards.
Oh, and, my gosh!
They wanted me to go to the hospital and all that, and I wouldn't go because I knew I wanted to race the next day. So they just taped me up across my eyebrows and all that stuff that were split open and all. And I laid on the back. I had a truck with a trailer, open trailer, and a truck. The midget was on the truck, and the sprint car was on the trailer. And I just laid on the back of the truck and tried to sleep going to Sacramento because my head hurt so bad. Man. And then that happened the next day when the hood hit me right across the forehead. So when it came Sunday and we were going to run and all, I told Steve, I said, you can run the sprint car. And he went down the first corner, first lap, and the brackets that were on the car that held the left front brake, they broke, came around and hooked the steering arm, locked the left front up, and he went. They had a drag strip on down the front straightaway, but he went down the drag strip and he went out into the artichokes and was halfway out in the artichoke field out there, and they had to bring him back again. And but that's that's
heck of a weekend of racing.
Yeah, it was a great weekend of racing, And but the hard part is that going back is that I look at what my dad drove and what they had for race cars and all that kind of stuff, and you think, man, for the guy, there were quite a few people killed in those days because there was nothing protecting you. And but then when it was midget racing and we'd go to the midget races, Gilmore, and there were nights that there were weeks that there were 7 races in the blue and 7 races in the red. They had red and blue series out there, and so there was a ton of racing right after the war.
And crowds every night
packed. I mean, I went to the Coliseum for a 3A race, and they had all the guys there, and that's where the Rams played, was the Coliseum. And it was, the whole Coliseum was packed, and they had only standing room only. Wow. And that I know of, I've heard stories that they never, but one time or never did ever have that big of a crowd for the Rams or anything they've ever had.
Wow.
And there's where SC and USC play. UCLA and SC play there too. They used to play, and that's there a lot of people go to that. And but the hard part that I started to say was that there were so many guys that got killed at the midget races and all that I knew and stuff like that it got to a point to where you didn't get to be real good friends with people. You didn't get to be buddies. And then when C-Rock got killed and Sonny Pratt, from then on, I just took and I was friends, talked to him and stuff like that, but I never got tight with anybody again, because you didn't know. You'd go to the racetrack and you didn't know if you were if everybody was coming home or not, and that was Johnny White flipped at Terre Haute, and when he flipped at Terre Haute, it paralyzed him and all that stuff, and I was the next one out to qualify when they took him out of there in the ambulance to go to, to the hospital and all. So, and then we did the year that we ran. I wasn't driving. Carl Williams was driving George Snyder was driving my car, and we went to Reading. And at Reading, Judd Larson and Red Regal got killed. Then we went to Oklahoma, and Ron Lux got killed. Then we went to Ascot at the end of the year, and Branson, and I just said his name the other day. I can't. It's just bad. He was driving for Agaginian and supposed to run the Speedway. He was running Aggie's Champ car, and he was driving Wally Muskowski's Sprint car, and he hit the rear bumper of Branson going down a straightaway, and it hit him right in the face, and it killed him.
Dick?
Dick Atkins. Dick Atkins, yeah. So we killed 5 that year alone, you know, and a lot of other drivers that, you know, and then they went to roll bars, so that helped it, and now, you know, they've got roll cages that are, you know, safer than what I used. And when I drove a jalopy with Parnelli, you know, they weren't as safe. The jalopy wasn't as safe as what they got today. So,
what year did you move to the Midwest?
We moved here in '71 for good.
Okay, and what year did you two meet?
63.
Tell me that story.
1963.
63. We'd gone to Allentown and run, and when we left Allentown, Don Brown and some of the guys were going to a friend of hers' house that she was, pardon me, and she was over there, and they all slept on the floor and all, but Don had crashed going there and had to fix his station wagon so we could go to Trenton the next day. And when we went to Trenton the next day, Cotton Farmer introduced me to her. And the next year when I came back, you know, I got a date with her at the Speedway, and that's the year that we got married.
And he hasn't spoken to Cotton since.
Well, that's Cotton's loss.
Yeah, no. Cotton, it was just, he was such a super guy, it was unbelievable.
Well, Rosemary, you've always been very nice to me, and I appreciate it. When you moved here, and you talked about when you stopped driving, when Steve came along, you became a car owner. Andy, sorry.
Yeah,
Andy.
That's all right.
And you became a car owner, but did you help and stooge at Indy at the Speedway?
I helped
before that or after that?
I did before that.
Okay.
And during that time. And the first time I worked at the Speedway was for A.J. Watson, and Roger Ward won the Speedway, and that was '59. And then I worked for Johnny Paulson, and I worked for A.J., and I worked for Penske 1 year. I was a stooge for Penske, and then I was a chief mechanic on 2 cars in 1965 and 66. Chuck Rohde drove the one in 65, and in 66 it was Mr. Petroleum and Larry Dixon. It was his rookie year. So,
when you quit driving, you became a car owner probably right away, basically.
I was a car owner before.
Yeah,
I drove,
as far as hiring drivers.
Yeah, after that, I hired drivers, but I still ended up racing some more because one time Wally Muskowski and AJ AJ was going to drive for me at Allentown, and they got fogged in Dayton, Ohio, and never made it. And so I had to borrow a helmet and a uniform and stuff, and I drove my own car that day after, and I hadn't run for probably a year and a half or whatever. And I ran that day at Allentown.
I've got a list here, 2 pages long, of drivers that drove for you.
Yeah.
And with a lot of these lists, this probably isn't even all of them. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to name a third of these guys just so people get a clue about this. And then I want to ask you about a couple. But just looking down this list, we have Mario Andretti, Blaney, Bliss, Bloom, Booth, Chuck Booth, Steve Butler, Billy Cantrell, Dana and Pancho Carter, Casella, Steve Chassie, Jimmy Davies, Derek Davidson, Larry Dixon, Foss, AJ Foyt, of course, Russ Gamester, Chuck Gurney, Hodenschild, Hillenberg, Hodges.
Well, there should be two Gurneys in there. There should
There
be
is.
Gene Gurney. That was Chuck's dad.
Oh, okay.
And Chuck both drove for me.
Howerton, Hurdabeast, Jones. It's amazing. Everyone you can think of on this list. McCluskey, Joey Kerr, of course. Opperman, Pancratz, Parsons, Pratt, Peterball. It's everyone you've ever heard of. Rutherford, Saldana, Lloyd Ruby. The list is unbelievable, the guys that drove for you. And I want to ask you about a couple of these guys and guys driving for you. First off, I want to go right to A.J. Foyt. When did you find out? How did it become apparent to you when you knew Foyt was something special? Did you see him or did you hear about him? How, because, a guy like me, I didn't experience that.
I was with my dad in 1956, and we came back to the Speedway, okay? And that was the first time AJ ever ran a USAC race with a midget.
Okay.
And in those days, they had 16th Street. He made 2 features that and he missed one. And I just was standing there and I was talking to him and just walked up and talking to him, and Higman came over and we all 3 were talking. And then later that summer I came back with Joe Kleinbauer, and I got more friendly with him and ended up going to a race with him that he didn't have anybody that was going with him, and I'd been penalized because I called Norm Hall a balloon foot and they told me I had to stay home. And I went up there with him, and then finished that year out. And then he came to California to the races in California, and then it just went on from there. And but we used, there were times that he'd have an apartment, and you might stay at the apartment, or he had the house trailer, and we traveled and went places and raced against each other, and it was just and working for him at the Speedway and everything like that. It was it was just part of life. It was A.J. Foyt was the same as you are. They're just. Everybody was the same. They're just, guys that did their thing and the whole shooting match. So,
how about guys that were Indy winners that drove for you? Can you remember a few of those? We got Foyt,
Mario, Foyt, and Rutherford.
The answer.
No, Al.
Okay. Bobby didn't.
Parnelli Jones.
Parnelli.
Yeah.
George Snyder.
Ruby never did win, did he? No.
No, I like Ruby though. I like reading about him.
Oh yeah, Lloyd was a
George
super
Snyder
guy.
did.
Who?
Snyder. He didn't win though.
Who?
No.
Oh. There's those guys drove for me, and
Unreal.
yeah.
Vukovic Jr. was in here. Jimmy
Yeah.
White. Just this list is
There's
amazing.
a lot of
all the way up to John Stambro's on here.
There are a lot of guys that drove for me that are that didn't win the Speedway, but should have.
Yeah.
Is the way I looked at it.
That reminds me
that had a chance, and everything was going their way, and something happened.
That takes me to Pancho Carter.
Right.
And a lot of people that would read about you or know about you, they're going to know about Pancho and you guys teaming up and just going on a rampage. How did you discover Pancho? How'd that come about?
Well, Pancho, I knew his dad very well.
He drove for you.
No, his dad never did drive for me.
Oh, okay. I thought he did.
No, he never did. Pancho's brother drove for me, but Pancho, his brother would always get mad at him for not getting him rides, and his dad would try and get him rides and all, and so Pancho talked me into it, and Dwayne and I let him drive for us, and because I didn't like running 2 cars, because with Pancho, the one was the main thing, and I didn't want to run 2 cars, so I didn't do it. But when he wanted me to do that, I did it. But the way I met Pancho is I met him with his dad and all, but he was driving for his dad, and he was driving for his father-in-law, Carl Forberg.
Yes.
And Snyder was driving for Grant King, and I was working for Grant King and working for Watson, and Milwaukee was that weekend, and they had practice on Saturday night, and Knoxville ran on they had practice on Saturday during the day at Milwaukee, and they had Knoxville that night. And Snyder told me that, he says, now I'm going to do everything I can to get there. He says, I'm going to try and get a plane flight to get there and all that. And I told him, I said, now, if I hire somebody else and they hot lap the car, you're not going to drive it. I said, so if you can't make it, don't do it. Well, I had a ton of guys wanting to drive the car. Asking me about driving it. And to get them off my back and get them to quit bothering me, and I knew it would upset them all. They'd all get mad, and they did, and they all badmouthed him. But I told them, I said, well, I got a hold of Pancho. I'm gonna let him drive it. And I hadn't talked to Pancho, and I had to call his sister, Joan, his half-sister, and find out how to get a hold of him. And she got a hold of him, and I asked him, I said, hey, I'm going to Knoxville. I said, you want to run the sprint car at Knoxville? And he said, yeah. He says, I'm running Friday night at Milwaukee, the midget track up there, Klein's Corners. And he said, I can come out there. So he did, and he came to the motel, and he stayed at the motel and all. And we had a fight. My wife and I had a fight before we went out there. And I opened my suitcase up, and when I opened my suitcase up, here's a big teddy bear into it. And he looked at me like, what's going on, And that was our first race, and it turned out to be real good, except Dixon wanted to ride because his car had quit and something happened to it, and he was going for points, and I told him, no, I'm not giving the ride away. I said, if you can talk him into it, then I'll do it. But I said, I am not even talking to him about it. It's up to you. And Pancho got to thinking, well, it might help me later on and all that stuff, so he gave the ride to Dixon. But we had taken, and we had qualified 5th quick, which we'd have started outside in the front row, and he had won the heat race, and I know it would have been his first win because we were faster than anybody there. And the funny thing that happened was that he went out and hot lapped, and he told me, he says, I get in the corner, and he said, the car gets in the corner really good. He says, but right in the middle it gets loose, and then he says it doesn't want to drive off the corner. And I said, I can fix that. And so I took some stagger out of it and put a lower gear into it. And he said, you put a lower gear into it? And I said, yeah. I said, that'll make the car set down real quick, and I said it'll drive off the corner harder, and taking a stagger out will make it drive off more. And I said it'll help it. And we weren't fast at the time when we did it, and we ended up 5th quick. And afterwards he says, man, I'd have never ever believed that would have worked. He said, man, I never felt something hook up like that when I did it. Well, then the next day we went to the mile at Springfield and ran there, and he had quick time, won the heat race, and we got rained out at the mile. And then we started running pavement, and he started winning races, and we started doing real good together. And it was it's what I try to explain to people today, and they don't. The kids today don't understand it, and I'd say 2/3 of the owners don't understand it either, that it has to be a combination to win all the time and to be at the top of what you're doing. The driver, Pancho, we would talk about things. We didn't argue about things. We didn't argue. If he wanted to try something that I had tried before that didn't work, I'd still do it, just so he knew it didn't work. Okay, that he wasn't, that I wasn't lying to him, or he didn't have to believe what I said. And that, right off the bat, made a real big change in what, in what was going on, because he wouldn't say anything except it's a little bit loose, or and Pancho would say, I've never driven a car that's too tight. So he says, you just make it tight, and make it fast, and make it stop, and I'll do the rest. Wow. And that's the way it always was. And we would do the things together. I could watch him and not even have to talk to him and know what the car was doing, but I'd still ask him, does it feel okay, and stuff like that, and that was all. That's all it was. And
Wow.
he was like Foyt in the way that Foyt would concentrate on driving a race car, but Foyt was he wanted to be mechanic too, but he would concentrate real hard on driving a race car. And most of the drivers will come in, well, we need to put this tire on, we need to change this, we need to do this, and all that kind of stuff. And with Pancho, he didn't know the gear, he didn't know the stagger, he didn't know where the weight was, he didn't know anything, and everybody would get mad at him because they'd ask him, how much stagger do you run? He said, I don't know, go ask me. And I'd tell him.
Yeah.
And one time at Terre Haute, I was walking along, and Sheldon Kinzer and Galen were walking there, and they asked Pancho what gear we were running, and Pancho said, I don't know. He says, ask him. So Sheldon asked me what it was, and as they were walking, they started to walk away, and Sheldon said to Galen, he says, man, he says, he didn't even tell, he said, he knows what gear is in the car, I know he knows, and he said, he lies to us. So I walked up and tapped Sheldon on the shoulder, and I said, come over to the race car a minute, and he and Galen walked over, and I went to the toolbox and got the wrenches and all to take the gear out of it, and he says, what's that for? And I said, you're going to pull the gear out of this thing. And he says, no, I'm not. And I knocked him down on the ground. And I said, you're going to pull the gear out of this right now, or you're not going to run the feature today.
Yeah.
And so he and Galen pulled the gear out of it, and it was the gear I said it was. And he turned to Galen and says, how can they run that gear? And Galen says, because their car's different, their driver's different, their motor's different. He said, you have to do your own race car. And that was what, and then they started to leave, and I said, hey, guys, you forgot to put the gear oil in it. Finish it,
Put it back together.
From then on, Galen, I would, he always knew that I wouldn't lie to Galen for nothing. And Galen told Sheldon, he said, now you'll learn that he's telling you the truth, that because I could not take, and if you asked me what gear I was running, I had to tell you, because I couldn't remember if I lied to you, and you asked me what gear I put in there, and I couldn't remember what I lied, or I told somebody else some other gear, and you asked them something, and the conversation went. So I just made it that if they wanted to know what stagger I had or what gear I had, I would just tell them, because it was too hard to try and keep from if you started lying, you didn't have any idea what you said. So it was easier just to tell the truth and do it.
And they didn't believe you anyway.
Yeah.
They didn't believe us anyway.
But you guys had them covered.
Oh, yeah.
Now, was that in the yellow Dobbins car right away, or was that the next year? When did that car come about, the yellow number 6?
The yellow number 6 came the next year. That's the year we won the championship. The year that he started driving for me was, the blue. That car was either the yellow 14 or it was the blue 12. I don't remember which.
Are these all sprint cars you built?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You build your own, and I mean, for years you built your own chassis.
Right, yes.
I've got a Stapp car right now.
Do you?
Yeah, and I think it's a Stapp car, and I know you hear that all day long, but I'm going to throw it in the truck and bring it to you and just let you look at it. That's the best way to do it.
There's
I got it.
Paul
in Detroit.
Martin's out in Oklahoma. You know Paul.
Yeah.
He has all kinds of stuff. He's got 3 cars that he wants me to look at.
Good.
And that he said he doesn't know if they're real or if they're copies, because there were in those days there were a lot of copies, guys that copy what you had.
Yeah.
But what they didn't realize is if they copied what I had, they were 2 years behind, because I was already 2 years ahead on what I was going to do and changing and doing with the race car all the time. So I didn't care if they copied. I'd give them, I'd let them know. Stanton, we went to Phoenix with 2 cars for Bob Calder, and he was standing over there looking at the cars in the back of the truck. It was frames and bodies. And he was looking at them, and I said, see anything familiar? And he goes, no, not really. And so I pointed out things that were familiar. And he says, yeah, that is familiar. I said, yeah. I said, I saw that on your car, and I said, I figured it was good, so I put it on mine.
Oh, yeah.
And Stanton says, what do you mean? I said, I look at everybody's cars. Everybody that builds a car, because I believe that every car that's built, if it's built by an individual, has one good idea. Now, if you can get that one good idea off of every car that's built, you're so far ahead of everybody else that you got it made.
That's excellent.
I said, and people would tell me, you're looking at the piece of shit. What are you looking at that piece of shit for? And I tell them, because there's one good idea on it somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, I just tossed Stanton in the pits where the trumpet said, I tossed him the tape measure. I said, measure it. And he goes, what? I said, measure it. I said, you can measure it. And he told me the next year, he says, my car, he had a different roll cage and all, but he said, the car I built, all the points are exactly like your car is. You know, and I said, good. I said, I hope you win every race with it, you know. And he was running the Outlaws and all that. And Gary and I were very good friends, still are, and I'd do anything for him, you know, because he just, you know, that's the kind of guy he is.
Very cool. I've been told by guys over the years that you were a car owner that you expected your drivers to stand on the gas. I mean, I know all car owners do, but if you were going to drive for you, you were expected to gas it and do your job. Do certain drivers come to mind that were just hard chargers or
most
wild
everybody
guys?
I ever hired, one Scratch Daniels I never got, and he was one that he wanted to drive for me, but he had already made another deal. But he was one that you know drove the way that I like to work with a guy.
Yeah.
But my deal is that there's two things I'd tell him. I'd tell him put both feet on the right-hand side of the torque tube, you know, and I said, or drive it like you stole it. I said, I don't care. If you're going forward and you crash, I said, and you're trying as hard as you can, that's no problem. But if you're running 18th and you're just sitting there driving, I said, you're in trouble. Yeah. And I said, the other thing is this is how I make a living, this is how you make a living. Don't get to third and realize, oh man, can't figure it all out in your head because you have enough time to do it of what your percentage is and not want to take a chance of going on. And I said, and there's been there's been times that Pancho was running second and he went for the lead and we ended up fourth. And he would come in and he would be so mad that he'd throw things and he wouldn't talk to anybody and all that kind of stuff. And people, thought we were mad at each other and all that. And there was never once that I ever told him that he did something wrong, even if he turned it over, or that if he screwed up and went backwards, that's fine. Because you were going forward. He was as pissed as you were. Yeah. That's right. I wasn't mad. Yeah. I was not mad at all. He was mad. Yeah. And he was mad when JP or any of the guys in his age group and his group beat him. That really got to him. And if the guy, like we ran second at Knoxville one time, and Raleigh Beal beat him, and he says, he's an old man, and he said, I'm going to let that go. But he said he'll never do it again. And the truth was, he never did.
That was it.
Yeah, because. Wow. But it was because Pancho believed it wasn't like Opperman did it. Yeah. Opperman do it, then you heard about it all the way home and everything else. Whether I screwed up or he screwed up, either way. But
there's a story I want to ask you about with Opperman on the ABC World of Sports at Terre Haute.
Right.
Tell me about that story with the injector stacks.
That story, I had taken and put rock guards on it. I'd put stuff on it everywhere to cover everything. And we had quick time, and he had 6 quick time. And we could pass him in a corner, but he could beat us down a straightaway. And I could hear the motor missing. and I didn't know what it was, but I could hear it missing. And the two raced to the end, and we only had 7 cylinders, and he had 8. And his motor was really running, and he was driving really hard, and he did a heck of a job.
Yeah, you weren't racing a slouch that day.
No. You were racing a super race driver. And when it was over with, Pancho, when he got out of the car, got up, walked over the steering wheel, stomped the air cleaners down, and walked off the nose. And I was going out to the truck to get the truck and trailer and bring it in, and I just turned to him and I said, "Hey, big boy," I said, "you just bought a set of air cleaners?" And he says, "I don't care what I blah, 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 blah." Man, he's yelling and screaming. He says, "You realize who beat me?" And I said, "Yeah," but I said he had an advantage. Give it up, And
wow.
That was in Speedy Bill, till the day Speedy Bill died. He would always tell me, "Boy," he says, "we whipped your ass at Terre Haute." And I said, "Yep, you did." And I just, because I didn't want to argue with him, I didn't want to get in a thrash with him, because I liked Speedy. But whether he believes us or not, this plug was hanging on the wire. Yeah. Everybody there saw it.
I've heard that numerous times.
So it wasn't like, Pancho said we lost a cylinder and you couldn't tell which one it was or what it was. And I looked at that, and it had to be. It either had to throw a rock off the right rear and hit the wall and come back and hit it, or the right front had to throw it and hit the wall and it had to come in and out. Because there was no way that you could have ever hit the spark plugs by the way I had them covered up.
Now, Opperman's on your list as drivers.
Right.
Tell me about Opperman.
Well, Opperman wanted to drive the pavement, and he had never run the pavement before. And so I told him, I said, "We'll go to Salem the end of the year for the snowball or whatever they call it, and you can drive it." And and we went down there and we ran. He stayed at the house, and he and Andy had a ball, and it was really a good time. And we went down there, and he was in the race and ran over something, and it cut the right front tire, and it went down. And he went in the corner and he caught the fence, and Roy Hicks was right behind him, and Roy Hicks went over the back of him and went out of Salem from when it happened. And Op came back into the pits, and Op, he's apologized to me. I said, "Hey, that's what happens." I said, "The tire goes flat. It's pretty hard to turn these things." But he was, Opperman. Another story about Opperman was Pancho was coming from Michigan, and I asked him to warm the car up for me. And so he went out and he warmed the car up, and he came back, hot lapped it, and came back in, and he says, "Man, there's a couple things you need to do." He says, "You need to take the right front brake off it, because those guys only ran three-wheel brakes. They didn't run the right front." And he says, "You need to take that off it." And he says, "You need to take a little bit of weight out of it." He said, it's really driving hard, driving straight off the corner really hard and all." And I said, "Okay." Well, I did. I took the brake off of it, but he built the motors for Bogar and was a mechanic from out in Nebraska. Now see, that's what happens to me. Because a real good motor man and mechanic over east and for Opperman and all that stuff. But he's standing there, and Opperman's telling me this, and he says to Opperman, he says, "That's it." He says, "Go ahead, tell him all these things, He says, "Right now," he says, "you just hot-lapped his car faster than you hot-lapped our car." He says, "You're faster in his car than you are in ours. So go ahead and help him be faster." Well, it didn't help us, because I screwed up and took the brake off, because I thought, well, we'll give this a try and see what happens. Well, Pancho would like to put her in the parking lot in the first turn. He came in.
He was used to that brake.
And he says, "Man, what's wrong with the brakes on this thing?" And I said, "Well, Op said it would really help if we took the right front off of it and did that." And he says, "Put the right front back on it." And he said, "Don't listen to anybody ever again. I don't care what you do." He says, "We just about made her into Harrisburg." He said, he said, "I didn't think I was going to get her saved down there." And I said, "Okay." And I put it back onto it. And we ran third that night, and we had Paxton was ahead of us, and the one that always said, "Racing, I have the most fun
Toby Tobias?
No, not Toby. That's bad. He'd say, the reason I race is I have the most fun of anything I do with my clothes on, and that was his thing. And but he's from over there and famous and driving over there and all that. But it took us 3 races. Huh?
Lee Osborne.
No, and it took us 3 races before we finally figured the drag tires out.
Yeah.
And we won the 4th one afterwards. And I helped Toby because Toby was running the drag tires out here, and they didn't work at all out here. And I gave him a set of diamonds and put on it, and he put them on the car, and he came from like 18th to 4th. He said, "Man, I can't believe that." I said, "That's why we run what you run over there, and that's why we run what we run here." Yeah. And after that, Toby won the Terre Haute, and he had diamonds on. He didn't have the drag tires like he ran over there. But
what other than the Foyt and Poncho and Opperman, what are some other drivers that might stick out in your head as just smart drivers or calculating or who tore up a lot of shit? And seems like he always remember those guys, But
I never had anybody that really tore up a lot of stuff. Snyder, he was real good. He won for me. I had a guy that drove for me in California, that the one who was driving the truck when Don Brown was broken down, Steve Kinnick, and he drove for me, and at Ascot, he was unbelievable because he would drive the car all the way down the straightaway and he'd still be flat in the throttle and he'd back it up till a bumper hit the fence in the middle and then drive it off.
So pretty.
And he was really, an awesome driver. But when we came back here to race, these guys ran a little bit different and all, and he ended up driving for Seymour and flipped at Kansas City, and in fact, he quit racing over that. But he was good on pavement. He was good on dirt and all. But he could flat qualify at Ascot, and then there were a lot of other guys that could too. But I never had any drivers that. I had most of the drivers I had. They all really stood out, but. Joe Saldana and all of them. Joe drove for me, and we started 4th, and we worked our way all the way back to 17th, and Duke Cook was getting ready to pass him, and Joe said that to himself that Duke Cook never in his life could beat this race car, and so Joe started driving the car as hard as he could, and we got back to 2nd, and we had a torsion arm brake on it, and so we fell out of the race, and when it was over with, Joe told me, he said, I always thought Poncho just sat there and drove it. He said it was easy to drive. He said, my God, he says, he drives that thing. He said, I can't drive it as hard as he drove it. Wow. And he said, I can't believe he drives that hard, And,
wow.
But that was, he was, Snyder was a lot like Poncho. He didn't care if school kept or if it let out. You just did whatever you wanted to do to the car, and he'd just go out and drive it, and he'd win races in it, and all. And he was just a California guy that didn't care. What the deal was, but
what were some of the bigger races you can remember that come to mind as big wins or just fun, good racing, races?
I think all of
championships.
Them
obviously, you got those under your belt.
They don't championships.
They don't have the same.
The only
feel.
thing the championships don't mean anything to me. They're that much. Winning is what always meant something to me, and I knew that if you won and you won the most races and you did the best, then that was just something they gave you with it.
Side effect.
That's it. And that's the way it was. But she just handed me this deal here. After Poncho got hurt in the champ car, and we came back and won Raceway Park, and that deal, he still can't bend his ankle. Yeah. So I had to make a throttle that he had to lift his leg up and down and up and down. And if you sit in a chair sometime, try and lift your leg up and down, and and work the throttle. Well, we spent Friday afternoon, and it was about 110 degrees at Raceway Park out on the road course because you couldn't go test on the track. And I mean, he lost 10 pounds, and I changed springs and made things and all that kind of stuff, and I made a knockoff hub because that's the only way he could get out of this car.
Yeah.
And got all that, and I told him when we got to Raceway Park that night, I said, now, if you can't do it, if it's too much and all that, I said, just, stop on the back straightaway and have them push you around, and it's the motor's bad or something like that, or, I said, it's not going to be because you can't drive it. So I said, just do it. Well, that night, he had fast time, won the heat, and won the feature. And when it was over with, it was a deal where we had to lift him out of the car, and he was worn out. And he went home, and he said, I'll let you know in the morning if we're going to go to Winchester. He says, because I don't know if I can or not. Well, he did the same thing at Winchester, but the funny part of this is he passed Jerry Weeks. And when he passed Jerry, Jerry says, I'm driving as hard as I can drive, both hands on the steering wheel, just running for all she's worth. And he says, here comes Pancho by me, lapping me, and he's pushing the throttle down with his hand on his right foot and steering with one hand, and he just drove by me, lapping me. Jeez. He said, I decided it was time to quit.
Yeah, and, that would be a wake-up call.
And he said, I wasn't going to make it to that caliber of, driver. And
that was all after the Phoenix IndyCar crash.
Right.
It really tore up his leg and his hip and whatnot.
Another one that was funny was we were on the mile, and Pancho passed Chassis going in a corner, and he was lapping him. And when he passed him, when the race was over, Chassis came down. He says, man, don't be mad at me. Don't be mad at me. He said, the throttle's stuck on the car. And he said, I wasn't trying to race with you. He said, I knew you were lapping me. He says, but the throttle's stuck. And he says, I couldn't get her slowed down. And Pancho looked at him, and he says, you made it, didn't you? And Chassis had no idea of what he meant when he said, you made it, didn't you? And Pancho drove by him.
Man,
unreal. And then Chassis figured that out. But the other one, Gary Irvin came over, and Pancho had set the world's record at Winchester, and he was sitting on a box. He always went over and sat on a box, and we didn't talk to him because he went over and came back into our world. Because when he qualified or he ran a race, most time you had to help him out of the car, and he had to take 2-3 minutes or longer to come back into reality because he concentrated so hard. Well, he was sitting on the box, and he was sitting there with his head down, and Gary walked up to him, and he says, Pancho, he said, I got to go qualify just in a couple cars. He says, how do you get around this place? And Pancho looked up at him, and he goes, fast, just effing fast. Wow. And Gary looked at him and just walked away. And I was standing there, and I just sat on the ground. I got to laughing so hard. And then he came, and then Pancho was back to being normal, And he says, what are you laughing about? I said, nothing, And then I told him later, and he goes, I thought I said something to. I thought Gary was here, but he said then he wasn't here. So I didn't know if he was really here or not. But it was. We'd go to restaurants and throw food. And we did everything. I mean, we had the police in Brownsburg. They'd block streets off, so we'd go start the race car at night. Wow. And where our shop was on Main Street, we'd push it down to the shopping center, and then we'd push it and fire it up coming back the other way. And the police never bothered you. Or we'd go around the block where the old shop is, where we are now. And
tires in the railroad.
And the most fun we had is when the railroad would go by, and they'd have empty box cars, and then we had a steel company out west of town, out in Crawfordsville, and they'd have gondolas, and they were usually empty going west, and we'd put all our tires out next to the building. So we would take and get the tires, and we'd stand out and throw the tires in the gondola if you didn't want to get hit, or you'd throw them into the boxcar. Yeah. Well, the bad thing about the boxcar is that if you didn't time it just right, it would hit the door and come right back at you. And I had numerous times hit my legs and knock my feet and do a tumble salt. And the best one we ever did is Pancho and I picked up a 1020 truck tire and threw it on a flat car. Well, it landed on a flat car, except that it flipped a couple times and it just barely cleared the lights on the police car on the other side of the railroad track. Well, they came over to in front of the shop, and he came in, and he's jumping on us about that. And I said, look in your book and show me where it's illegal for us to throw tires on the train. And I said, when you get done, I said, call Buffington. I said, he comes down and does it with us. And that was another one of the police officers, and he would. So he left. He didn't. But before he left, Pancho says, go out. Come on out here. He says, pick that up and you'll see. He said, it isn't easy to throw it up on there. And the officer picked it up and he dropped it back down and it spilt that ugly water all over his shoes and pants and everything. But the other thing we do that I used to enjoy doing is we put a ladder on the railroad tracks with a big spotlight onto it, and then we'd bring a train horn out that we had off of one of the trucks, and we would take, when the train was coming, we would take and blow the horn and flash the light, and the trains would stop way back down at the east side of town when we do it. Then we'd put everything inside, or we'd go out there and do it, and some kid would be, coming from the corner real fast, and when he'd come up the street, when he'd get just at the right spot, we'd turn the light on and blow the horn, and we had him drive off into the field across the street and almost into the apartments, and I mean scare people, and then we'd yell at them, stop going so fast down the street.
Yeah, that'll teach them.
And a guy, we had our dog, and a guy down the street had a dog, and this kid came by there in his car, and he was running a good 55 mile an hour on that little short street, and I threw the wingnut hammer through the windshield and hit him with it.
Wow.
And he stopped the car because it hit him right in the head, and he was bleeding and everything else, and I went down and got the wingnut hammer back, and I told him, I said, we got dogs and kids in this neighborhood. If you ever come down the street again as fast as you just came down it, I said, I'm going to beat you with that hammer, not just throw it at you, And the police came over and asked me what happened, and I said, it slipped out of my hand, and I said, and they said, we've had a lot of calls about him, going down this street fast. I said, yeah. I said, you've had him from here, and you've had him from your neighbors. And I said, I just decided that, I was going to make like I was going to throw it, but it slipped, and I said it hit his car and knocked the windshield out of it. And I said, I haven't seen him. I said, does he go a different direction or what? And he says, we haven't had any phone calls.
No more calls. That ended that. I've got a list here of some stories like these that Joey sent me, and because he gets to spend a lot of time with you, and here's the stories, and I'm jealous. I'm going to mention these, and I want you to tell me the story if you can remember it. The first one is a rental car story with A.J. Foyt.
Okay, that was, I drove a Ford, not, my dad had one, the Ford pickup truck, but it was like a station wagon.
Econoline.
No.
Or
Ranchero.
Ranchero, yep.
I took a Ranchero to Texas for him.
Okay.
And hauled a bunch of stuff down there and spent a few days down there. And then we flew to Detroit because he had a stock car ride up there with in the Plymouth with Ray Nichols. And there was a little deal that happened up there too before the other. But I kept looking at this car, and he'd get out of it, and there was a big tank behind the seat and another little tank on top of it. And I said, AJ, what's in that big tank down there? And he goes, that's windshield washer fluid. Get away from the car. Quit looking at that stuff. And I said, well, how come the windshield washer fluid tank goes to the motor? And there was a hose going to the motor. And he says, I told you to get away from the car. And I said, okay, I will. So a little bit later, I said, it won't go the 100 miles without putting more oil in it, will it? And he goes, I will answer that with a yes, but don't say it anymore, because he said, Ray has already asked me what you're looking in the car and all that stuff. And I said, I'm not going to tell anybody. That's not it. But AJ had rented a Ford Falcon, okay, because it was the cheapest. And we had taken the Firestone guys, Jack Miller and myself and AJ and two other guys, and we were going to dinner. The one just died the other day. He was with Firestone for years, and then he's been at the Speedway for quite a while. But we were going to dinner, and AJ had a habit of, if he didn't drive, that the person driving, he would put his foot on top of your foot on the gas pedal, and if you pulled your foot out from underneath his, okay, or you got on the brakes with your other foot, you had to buy dinner for everybody, you know.
Okay.
Well, I didn't have enough money to, make a down payment on a free lunch, and so I'm driving down, I'm on the sidewalk, and dodging in and out of cars, and the street cars go down the street. Well, we get to where there's a streetcar, and it's all blocked, so I jump up on the island and go through the island and come back down again, and when I'd run up where I couldn't get that I'd had to stop, I'd put it up into reverse and back into drive, and I jumped back and forth in the street doing that. And then we pulled into the restaurant where we were going. Well, all this time, Jack Miller, he turned so red that he looked like a signal. I thought he was going to have a heart attack in the back seat. And everybody's going, I'll buy dinner, put your foot on the brake, and I wouldn't do it. And so when we pulled into the parking lot, we pulled up and then up to the wall. I'm still flat on the gas going in the parking lot and up to the wall, and then I'm back and forth into reverse, and I get the car jumping back and forth, and I get it to a point, and I plug her into park, and AJ just keeps his foot on her, and he just keeps screaming. And I says, you're going to blow it up, and we're going to walk. And he takes his foot off it, and he says, you're the first person that ever didn't, that I couldn't get them to either lift or do that. I said, I ain't got enough money to even think about buying dinner. I said, no, And he says, well, you did a good job, and we go to dinner, Well, when we go back to the hotel, I drop him off, and there's a guy outside, and he grabs the luggage and all that stuff, and I said, I'll park this for you if you want me to. And he goes, no, that's okay, I'll park it. I says, well, when you park it, make sure you've got it to where it'll go forward, and make sure that when you park it, that you put it into park, I said, and then throw some sand and stuff underneath it, because I said, it's got a terrible oil leak into it. And the next morning they had towed it away, and we had another car there.
Killed that one.
Yeah, we had, and AJ, we used to do something that was a lot of fun, and we would take and put black shoe polish on our toes, and you would run to the wall, and you'd jump off the end of the bed and put your foot on the wall, and you'd walk up and walk across the ceiling as far as you could go, and the one that went the furthest on the ceiling, won. Well, I was number one. Well, AJ got mad, and they had a table there and a TV and all that, and he threw all of it, second floor, out into the parking lot, cleans the room out, and he said, I'll beat you this time for sure. And he went, he did it, and he didn't get as far as I got. And I said, now I'm going to show you I can go further. Well, I did it again, except you have to know where the stud is in the wall.
Oh, shit.
And I missed the stud, and I knocked the drywall into the next room. Okay, well, there's a guy and his wife in there, and they had just gotten married, and they're loving it up in there, and I knocked the drywall on top of them, and then I stick my head in the hole, and I say, sorry about that, I missed the stud, and they had to move them into another room. The guy was going to have the police come and everything else, and Floyd says, you got my credit card, just put it on the credit card, don't worry about it,
Yeah.
And he told me, he says, you cheat doing that. And we used to do it all the time. We do it at different, at motels whenever we were there. And there might be 10 guys doing it, but you had to move the stuff away from the wall, because if you didn't, if there was a table there or something, you'd crash that table every time. But and if you went somewhere with AJ, we left Syracuse one time, and the race was over, and he had a restaurant in Buffalo that he really liked to eat at, and we had an hour to go 135 miles, and we got there just as they put the close sign on the door. Yeah.
Wow.
He was in the grass, off in the grass on the other side. He never off. He was flat on the mat as fast as that car would go all the way to Buffalo. And we just missed making it by 2 minutes or 3 minutes is all we missed it by.
Man.
But he was one of a kind.
Tell me about AJ when he ran with the rear engine cars at Milwaukee. He got his dirt car out. Were you around for that deal?
Great story.
Yeah, because I've read about it and I've watched the footage, but to hear it from someone that was there is a little different.
I was helping him. Johnny Paulson was a mechanic, and I was helping him in Springfield, and we won.
He had the rear engine. The rear engine car wasn't done yet.
It wasn't done, and the guys were all going to Indy to finish it to come to Milwaukee.
Okay.
And AJ and I got in. We had the dirt car on the trailer, and we got the wagon, Sheridan Thompson.
Yeah.
We all towed with wagons or pickups. So we went to Milwaukee, and we went to bed and everything. We go to the racetrack the next day. Well, we find out that they had a problem. They didn't get it done. So I went over and unloaded the dirt car, and I was washing it, getting it clean and everything. And I'd already gone to Firestone, had them mount the tires up and everything else. AJ comes walking over there, and he says, "They didn't get the rear engine car done. What the hell are you doing?" And I said, "Hey, we're here. We'll just run the dirt car." "I'm not running that dirt car. I can't beat these guys with that dirt car." And I said, "Well, I'll hire somebody else and they can."
That'll help.
And I got cussed out at that. And then, so I finished washing it, and we pushed it over in the pits, and I put the tires and all onto it. And here he comes with his unit and his helmet, and the people are going crazy,
Wow.
So we fire it up and go out, and he warms up. And in Milwaukee, you would pit on the outside of the wall, not on the inside like they do now. We were on the outside of the wall. And he went out, and he hot lapped, and he came in, and I had him on the watches. And he was quick time on the watches, and so we're standing there, and I put more fuel into it, and checked the air and did all the stuff, and he was going to go back out again, and he asked me, he said, "How do we do in that first group?" And I said, "You did all right." I said, "You were okay, And so he went back out and practiced again. He came back in, and then somebody told him that he had fast time, and he didn't believe him. So he turned to me and he said, "How do we do this time?" And I said, "You're all right. We're looking okay." And he said, "What is all right? And what are we talking about?" And I said, "Well," as it looks right now, I said, "You're quick time by about 18 or 1900s.
Wow.
And he looks at me and he says, "Fat boy," he said, "there ain't no way." He said, "You can't even read watches." He said, "I don't know why I even take you with me. You can't do anything, So I went over to the car, and I put more fuel into it, and I got it, and I brought the fuel up where I figured I wanted it, and I got him all set to qualify, and they let him have another hot lap group. So we started and got ready to go, and I told him, "Hold it." And so I walked back there to him, and I said, "Hey, God," I said, "you're perfect at everything you do." I said, "Here, time yourself." And I threw the watches in his lap. Well, he threw the watches and hit me in the head with them and cussed me out, and he went out, and he came back in, and I told him, I said, "I'm not going to tell you how fast you were because I don't want to get hit again," And so he's and people are over there now because he was quicker yet.
Yeah, they got the watches on him too.
Yeah, and they're all talking to him and all that kind of stuff. And so I get the car, and he said, "Don't put any more fuel in it. It's right now." And I said, "Okay, I won't." So I just went and got fuel and put more fuel into it. And I went over and I put more air in the right rear tire. And because the right rear tire, at the air, in those tires that we ran in those days, you used to run like 22, 24, 26 pounds in the right rear, and you'd run 20, 22 or whatever in the left rear and get the stagger where you wanted. But you had to run more air in the tires because they were harder, and if you didn't, they'd shake. So I put air in the right rear tire, and he went out and qualified. And when he qualified, not only did he have quick time, but he was even quicker than he was when he practiced. And he came back in and some other people had come over there and told him, they said, "You're even quicker when you qualified." And so he comes over to me and he says, "You put more fuel in it. I could tell." He says, "The car was heavier." And I said, "Yeah, I did." Mm-hmm. And I said, "I put more air in the right rear so it wouldn't shake." And I said, "You never felt it shake, did you?" And he goes, "I did, but I didn't know that's what it was." Wow. I said, "You admitting that you didn't know what it was? Oh my God, what is going on?" And we were in Chicago on our way home, and we ran second, and I had changed the right rear tire. After he got past, and he was sitting there running second, I changed the right rear tire and put the other one on, and going to Chicago, we were talking back and forth about it and all, and north, probably still in Wisconsin, I said something about, I said, there was nothing wrong with that tire. "Oh yeah, there was something wrong with that tire." And I said, "No, there wasn't." Well, then I told him, I said, "AJ," I said, "I guarantee you, the only reason you stopped and had me change that tire and have to hold on to that burning wing nut, burn my hands, and fight that baby," I said, "is because you wanted to have an excuse for running second and getting beat." "No, you're wrong, man." He got mad and got carried on. And about halfway through the toll road in Chicago, he turned to me. He said, "You really think I did that?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I know you did it." And he looked at me and he goes, "You're right."
Wow.
And that's the way it was.
Wow.
And
for people that are going to listen to this that might not fully grasp that, we're talking this is an era when guys had rear engine cars and they were tiny little
they outclassed us all together.
Rear engine Indy car, and you guys unloaded a big dirt champ car that looked like a different class.
Their cars weighed 1,400 pounds and ours weighed 1,800 pounds.
I mean,
it's
monumental.
The people that you say are going to listen to this and all, if they didn't know AJ Foyt during the time that he drove, or didn't see him, or weren't race fans, they don't have any idea what he was. Because he was, he will be, till I die anyway, the greatest there ever was. I mean, he drove everything there was to drive. He wanted everything, and he used to be. He was the absolute hardest person in the world to work for at the Speedway and places like that, because he wanted things his way, even if they were wrong. And he had his Champ dirt car, and they were at a Chevrolet motor, and Gertie had built it. And Gertie came home, and Gertie was telling me stories that AJ had said. And AJ told Earl, he says, "You know what makes me so mad about Stapp?" And Earl says, "No, what?" He says, "You told me a lot of things, but what makes you so mad?" He says, "I'd tell him to do something, and he'd tell me, no, I'm not doing it. And then I'd get madder, and I'd yell and scream at him, and he'd tell me, that's not safe, or that's not the way it's supposed to be. It's not going to be right, and I'm not doing it. Get one of your other flunkies to do it." Mm-hmm. And AJ, wouldn't change it. He'd leave it go. And he said that would make him madder than anything, because I wasn't going to do something that I didn't think was right. And
very good.
But
tell me why you jumping over the wall at the pit wall, why you wear bib overalls now. I got a thumbs up from you. From Rosemary on that one.
We were at Oswego, New York, and Johnny Rutherford was driving for me, and you pushed the cars out on the front straightaway, and I had the wheel hammer in my hand, and I was walked over, and Oswego had a wall in the inside that was the pits were higher than the racetrack was, and you had to get off that wall. And I was going to check the tires, and John was just getting into the car, and I jumped off the wall. Well, I had on a pair of Levi's, and my Levi's went to my ankles, and I was standing there with my Levi's around my ankles with a T-shirt and my shorts on, and the crowd's applauding and yelling and screaming, and I'm waving to them, and I do a bow, and Rutherford, he goes, voila, and and all that stuff. And I finally pulled my pants up and went over and tightened the tires up on the race car. And Johnny says, "Man, there ain't nothing bothers you, is there?" And I said, "No, that's what happens." And from then on, I always wanted to wear bibs, but I had the Levi's because a lot of times I'd wear suspenders on Levi's because all my life I had trouble because I had no butt at all, and I had a big belly, and they wouldn't stay up. So it was a deal of where, holy mackerel, these bibs stay up. I don't have to all day long pull my pants up and all. So, but that's the story about the bibs coming down.
That's cool. That's good. These stories might jump around a little bit. This one's about your dad. Tell me about Babe and a couple guys once grabbing a reporter and roughing him up.
Yeah.
And what was that about? I don't know anything about that.
Now, I wasn't alive then, but it was at El Centro, California, and boy, I'd have to look it up because I can't remember. I was thinking Roy Russing. I can't remember who the driver was that he got killed. And they were taking pictures. The photographers from the newspaper were taking pictures. That was a big no-no back then. And my dad slammed the door on the back of the ambulance so they'd leave, and he turned around, and this photographer leaned over because the glass broke to take a picture, and my dad hauled off and cold-cocked him and then beat his camera to death on the ground, and the guy got up and he hit him again and knocked him down again, and the police that were at the racetrack came over there and all this kind of stuff, and they ended up going to court over it in Los Angeles. Wow. And all, and they won the deal because there were 3 or 4 other drivers involved in this deal of getting the ambulance going and everything else, but the photographer was for the Times Examiner, I don't remember now which one, but they quit putting anything about racing in the paper after that happened.
Yeah, I know, and people might not understand it. In that era, there were a large amount of people that were against auto racing, saying that it was too dangerous and that it needed to stop. They wanted to outlaw it, and because of that, they would try to keep reporters and photographers from taking pictures of crashes, especially crashes where the drivers were hurt. And I've read
fatalities and all
and
that.
I've read stories about drivers taking care of reporters like that. And it's
the only one I know of is the one where my dad did that and all. And the only other person I was there at this one, but they were at Riverside, and it was a sports car race, and my dad was officiating in the pits, and they had black flagged Revson. Peter Revson.
No, Lance Reventlow.
Oh, Lance Reventlow.
I've read that name before.
And
Revlon Cosmetics here.
Okay.
Yeah, and he had sports cars, and he had Traco, which was a real super motor build.
Oh yeah, the Travers and Coons.
Right, and they worked on it, and they had a problem, and we had oil coming out of it. And he got out of the car, and he got to cussing at my dad and all that stuff. And my dad said, "Now I have nothing to do with this. I've been told the car is leaking oil." And he said, "They brought you in with a black flag," and he said, "There's oil on the ground underneath it, so you can't go back out." Well, he cussed my dad again, and my dad hauled off and dropped him right in the pits. And Jim Travers and
Coons.
Yeah, and Coons, but I can't even his first name. But and the two of them, they congratulated my dad. They said that was the greatest thing they'd ever seen in automobile racing. They were so happy, you know.
Good.
And that, to me, I look at it as probably being one of the luckiest kids in the whole world, because I had a father that I never in my life ever heard anybody say anything bad to him or about him, and he helped me all the time in racing, and everybody was friends of his, and they would help me. They would talk to me, and there were guys Elmer George was the funniest one of all, because Elmer George, I was working the scoreboard for Aggie. I was like 12 years old or 13, and we were in Sacramento. And I walked over and was looking at the race car, and he was sitting on a tire. And he said, "You see anything you want to know about?" And I go, "No, I just looking at the steering gear that was in it," and I talked about that. And Elmer started talking to me, and he was talking to me like I was a mechanic that was 30 years old, and we're talking about things and all this, and Gordon Betts sees me, and he goes and has an officer throw me out, and Aggie has to get me back in, and that happened many times, and because that's how Gordon Betts was the absolute best official there ever was, because that's the way it was. If the rules said you did it that way, that's how you did it. And it didn't matter if it was Bill Vukovich or if it was Duke Cook. That's how it was. And but I'd talk to Elmer, and when then late, up the different races, and then I started racing against him and doing all that kind of stuff, and going over to their shop, and he'd sneak me in there because you weren't allowed in a speedway with a sprint car. So when Clarence would catch me over in his building, which was by the Firestone building, he'd tell him, "Go in the Firestone building." He's in there getting some tires mounted. He says, "You can't stop people from coming in and getting their tires mounted and picking them up." He said, and doing that, and so Clarence, I never got caught, because when we'd see Clarence, I'd already be gone for the Firestone building, and we weren't allowed to have sprint car motors in the garage area when I was a chief mechanic and working on other cars, and Foyt and I did, and Charlie used to come and tell us, "Hey, Clarence is in the pits," and we'd get him covered up and hidden, and he caught Foyt one time, and he was going to throw him out, and AJ had to take his motor and put it in a truck right then and get it out of the garage area, and I mean, that's it.
Champ cars only.
Yeah, champ cars only. Dirt cars and Indy cars were all allowed in there, and but Elmer was so different. He was so down to earth, and when he talked to you, I mean, he'd talk to me just like I was the same as him.
That's cool.
It wasn't like some of the heroes that thought they were really good, and you'd say hi to them, and they wouldn't say anything. Yeah. But in turn, a lot of the drivers, I didn't know whether they talked to me and said hi to me because of my dad, or because they wanted to say it to me, Yeah. But Sam Hanks and Parsons and all those guys, I mean, they talked to me, at length. I mean, I knew pretty well, who was the ones that were, that it wasn't my dad. It was my dad.
Yeah.
That they knew, and known for years, and were good friends with them. That they were, friendly and all with me, and it was a very good experience. But
to this day, I remember guys that were nice to me when I was a kid. Yeah. You remember that?
Oh, yeah.
It's all, when you're a kid, you don't have a lot on your mind.
Right.
And when one of your heroes talks to you, it sticks with you.
Well, it was that, I'd go sit behind the tires, and George and Amy could be sitting on a tire up in front, and we'd be talking and all that. And that's how I got away with being over in his pit, and a lot of the other ones that Gordon didn't see me. It was usually he'd see me going, back to the scoreboard or something, and I wasn't even allowed to go to the hot dog stand without somebody that worked for Aggie taking me to the hot dog stand, because the kids were not in the pits. They weren't allowed in the pits, but the scoreboard was, even though it was in the pits, that you could work the scoreboard. So
that's something that people might not understand either, is that children and some years women were not allowed in the pits.
Oh, long time.
That was
long time.
And explain to me about white pants.
Because
there was rules for that, wasn't there? So guys weren't just being fancy. There was a rule.
How about the picture right behind you, right there? Cloth helmet, goggles, tie, and a dress shirt.
Yeah, that's 1923. That Ralph De Palma and Packard IndyCar.
Right. That's what it was, a show. Mm-hmm. They put on a show, and they were a class act. The Gilmore cars were painted so beautiful. I mean, the pits had all these beautiful cars into it, Mm-hmm. And and 3A had the rule of white pants, and you could wear whatever color shirt you want, but if you were on a crew, you had to have a crew shirt with your white pants.
Had to look official.
That's right.
That's
and everybody,
cool.
and I mean, even in URA, when I started running midgets and all, you had to have white pants, because when I ran the first midget race I ran, the race car didn't even have a roll bar on it. And I stuck up out of it like he sticks out of that. And in this picture, you can see my feet up next to the motor where the pedals are, and there's no front belly pan.
Wow.
I have on a McCall helmet that Hal Minyard gave me. It was the third one he built because I was driving with my dad's old Cromwell, and and I had on a Bardol jacket and a seatbelt.
Wow.
We didn't have shoulder harnesses. We didn't have anything. Didn't have gloves.
Wow.
Just I put on a Bardol jacket, and Ascot and Gardena didn't bother you. But I learned when I got back here, and there was a few places out there, El Centro and all, that you would pack stuff underneath in your sleeves because the rocks off the right front would beat your arm.
Yeah.
Well, Henchman made a uniform that had a zipper in it, and you'd cut cardboard and put it in there.
Really?
And fill it up, because otherwise, the day after the race, both your arms would be just absolutely black and blue all over.
I've read about the cardboard, but never knew that Henchman actually made a suit for it.
He did. I
mean, we have rock guards today for a reason.
Right. Yeah. And the thing that in those days you had a windshield, and usually it was low enough that you got hit, that you didn't have it way up. And Cotton Farmer, I went to my first IMCA race, and they dropped a green flag for hot laps, and I was right behind Pete Fols and Hector Norrie's Offie, and it had knobs on it, and he stood on it, and he peeled my goggles off, he peeled my visor off my helmet, and I had my head buried down behind the windshield as it broke all up.
Jeez.
And I pulled into the pits, and Cotton came over, and he goes, "Hey, big boy, did you learn anything?" Well, we went out to the barns, and I took a set of Dutchmen, and I cut a big sheet of steel off the building and made it fit the cowl and drilled it and all that, and trimmed the sides a little bit. And he said, "Yeah, just leave them as big as you can make them." And then he stood in front of the race car, and he said, "Now, what can you see?" And I said, "I can't see you." He said, "Okay, trim about 2 inches off the top of it." Well, when I got that trimmed down to where I could see his nose, he said, "No more trimming, that's all."
Wow.
And he said, that way you can get down behind it and it won't beat you that bad. And at that point, I learned about the taping of the bottom lens to your goggles.
Yeah.
And so it couldn't beat them in against your eyes. And then we cut pieces of windshield that put screws in your helmet that went up on the top, and you could drop it down, and you put an Adel clamp onto it, and it set on your visor, and then you would raise it to where you could take and just raise your head up just a little bit, and it would beat it, but you could see underneath it, and you could just barely see over the windshield to see the guy in front of you. So then, in those days, you'd watch the guy in front of you, you'd see more of his roll cage, his roll bar, and that's what you went by, and you see him drop off to the bottom, and you knew you could feel the cushion, or you could see it out the side of the car.
Wow.
And that's how you got beat up, in the days of the Offies, IMCA, and knobs and everything.
What was the Sam Brown for?
The Sam Brown was a leather belt that went over your shoulder, under your shoulder, and had a big pad underneath on your right side, and it went around and hooked together, and then you hooked it back on the car on the shock bracket or something that you had back there, and the Sam Brown would hold you up in the car because we didn't have those big wraparound seats and all the driver comfort they've got today. And so you have that to hold you up in a long race. And then I learned at Salem that your helmet got too heavy, and what you do there is you put your head over on your shoulder and then get somebody to take 1 or 2 rolls of black tape and go underneath your arm and tape your helmet down to your shoulder, and by 2/3 of the race, the helmet was usually straight up and down or off the other side.
Yeah.
And I used to kid people. I said there was a lady in the grandstand, and when the race was over with, she thought, that I had. I got to remember how it goes. She thought I would cut my arm or something, and that I was bleeding on the right rear tire. What she didn't know, though, was it was my tongue dragging on the right rear tire.
That's what. Thank you, Rosemary. I forgot about the Sam Brown belts, and they're cool. I've seen pictures of them and seen them, in museums and whatnot. Those are very cool.
Unheard of.
Tell me about the year you were stooging at Indy, and you explained to the car chief, manifold was cracked, and he didn't believe you.
Oh, that I was working on Snyder's car, and our manifold, the pop off where it welded onto it.
What year would this have been? 60s?
Yeah, it was in the 60s, and no, it wasn't. It was in the 70s. It was a rear engine car, and it was a Foyt Ford, and I saw this crack on there, so I cleaned it and I buffed it all and took it over to at the Speedway. They had a welding garage over there, and I took it over and I welded it all up. Well, I told Leroy Neumeier was working on McCluskey's car, and he found theirs was cracked. So I did his and welded it up. Well, I went to Tony, AJ's dad, and told him, I said, hey, we found those on both those cars that the manifold's cracked where the pop-off is. I said, you want to check his and see, so we can fix it? And he told me, he said, there's so many people wiping and rubbing and everything on this car and checking it over that if there's a fly takes a dump on it somewhere, he said, they'll find it. And he says, so we're not going to worry about it. Well, race day, the only one that didn't have, that we didn't fix, that didn't have a problem was McElreath, except his radiator broke, and Foyt and I had to change his radiator, but Foyt's broke in the race, and I had to go back and weld it when McElreath came in, and then we put the manifold back on AJ's, and he went back out. And McElreath, then I helped him finish putting the radiator on McElreath's, and he went back out, and by not doing the board like I was supposed to and fueling Snyder, they didn't bring Snyder in. He ran out of fuel or he'd have won the race.
Oh man!
Yeah, so wow. That's what the deal was about the manifold being cracked.
Tell me about borrowing a station wagon and you welding blocks in the back and hauling a car out west. Does that ring a bell?
A station wagon?
You might have stole a station wagon, left a note on the front door. Was that you or another guy? Welded steel blocks under the rear end, towed to California, and then returned the car?
No, that was the original time that we went to Houston, Texas to run a sprint car race, and it was in the winter, just after they had a race down there, and they didn't have enough cars and all. So I had, I called him Hoot, but it was Steve Searock's car. And I didn't have a trailer, so I borrowed Johnny Paulson's trailer, Johnny Paulson's tires, Johnny Paulson's jack, and his tools. And we loaded down, all of us climbed in and loaded down. And we were just south of Indio, California, and I smelled something burning and looked back, and there's flames underneath his car.
Oh, wow.
And what it did is, by having all this weight sitting on the blocks that I'd put between the axle and the frame, because otherwise the trailer hitch was sitting on the ground,
yeah,
that it cooked the rear end in the car. So we jacked the trailer up and got it away from the car, because I didn't care if the car burned or not, that was his. And I called my dad, and he brought a truck down that we went, and my dad asked me if I needed any money, and I said, no, we got enough money. And that deal went into, we didn't have enough money, so there was Hadley car carriers at that time, and they were gasoline. So we would pull up and siphon gas out of their trucks so we could go. And C-Rock, he wasn't smart enough to know the difference between gasoline and diesel, and he got a big belch of diesel and was sicker than a dog. And then we didn't have enough money to eat, and we had Jerry, who I had gotten I bought the midget from, and he probably weighed 120 pounds, and I mean, the littlest guy you ever saw. Well, we'd eat, and we'd all have our tickets and all that kind of stuff, and we'd walk out, and he'd go to the bathroom, and when he went to the bathroom, we'd walk out. Well, he'd get out the window, so he'd get out the window, and away we'd go. Well, we stopped and ate 2 times, and then we had a flat tire on the trailer. Well, the spare on the trailer wasn't a good tire, so it wouldn't fit. Well, I went into this town, and there was a wrecking yard there, and I got over the fence, and I got a tire and a wheel, and I come back, and it doesn't fit either. So that next morning, I go in there, well, the guy's open now. So I've got 2 of his tires and wheels, and I've got mine, and I told him, I said, I got these 2 tires and wheels, and they don't fit the trailer, and this is the one that fits the trailer. So the guy goes and looks, and he finds one, and he says, man, these aren't as good as what you've got here. He said, I really, he said, I really don't, he said, I don't really feel good about, trading you tires and all that. And he says, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you $20, and I'll give you this tire that'll fit on your trailer. Well, I talked him, and I couldn't talk him out of it. So he gives me $20, and we get to the racetrack, and we run, and we're so far out of our league, it isn't funny. And then we go home, and going home, Watson and Foyt both gave me money so we could buy gas, and we could get something to eat and do all that stuff. And when we got back home, I went down to Hadley Transportation, and I told them what I'd done, that I'd siphoned them out of the truck, and the head man, he listens to all the story and all, and I said, I got to pay you for it, and I said, I can give you an estimate on how much gas we got, but I'm not for sure and all that stuff. And he says, hey, if you're smart enough and you want to do something bad enough that you'll go through that, he says, you don't owe me a dime.
Really?
And I said, no. I said, I got to pay you, because I said that's that's the only way I want to do it. No, he said, nope, you're not gonna. He says, that's our deal to get you to Texas.
That's cool.
So nothing happened there, and 2 weeks later, I get a letter, and it's a check, and he sponsored me for that year.
Really?
Yeah.
That's cool. Oh, that's neat.
Then my mom wrote to the people at the gas stations where we ate, because we kept the receipts and all that, and told them how much we owed, and she'd send them money. Well, one of the gas stations didn't have anything showing, nothing at all, and the other one did, and she sent them the money, and they sent a deal, thank you very much and all that. Well, I called a guy in Texas at that wrecking yard and told him what I'd done, and and he'd give me the $20 and all that stuff. And this guy, it was really funny, because the whole time he just kept cracking up, and I said, why are you laughing? I said, I stole from you, and then I took money from you, and he says, man, I've been tricked many, many ways, but this is so far above everything that's ever happened to me. He said, I can't believe it, And I told him, I said, I want to know how much the tires are, and I said, I'm going to give you the $20 back for year 2, and you tell me what I owe you for that other one that we didn't have the money to buy it and all that stuff. And he never would let me pay him. And he used to come up here and come to the races now and then, and I'd find out that he had gone down to Firestone and he'd given him money to sponsor the car to buy tires with.
That's cool.
Yeah, and,
that's cool. That's neat. That's neat. That's really neat.
Yeah, there's so many stories.
What goes around comes around. Yeah, that's
there's
good. So
many stories about things that happened on the road and things that went on that it's just we'd be here till next Friday.
Well, I only got a couple more I want to know about. Tell me about pulling a prank on a driver, making him think you peed in his helmet.
Oh, that was Wormy Booth, Chuck Booth. He at the Speedway, I had him helping me weld some ramps up for my truck because I built my truck up to put my sprint car on. And he cut all the fingers off my brand new gloves I had just bought.
Oh.
And just laughed. He thought it was funny, so I didn't do anything.
Yeah.
Well, we go to Reading, and the cars are all lined up, and I'm standing in front of his car, you know, and just standing there looking at him. And Chuck, he'd cuss at me, and he cussed at everybody. And I mean, he was just a miserable person. But he was a hell of a nice guy, but he was just miserable. And he couldn't figure out what I was doing, and he knew I was doing something because we were always pulling pranks on each other. Mm-hmm. And he took, and he didn't know what I was doing, and he was sitting there, and he always strapped in, got everything done, and then he'd yell at one of the guys, "Hand me my blanking helmet," you know.
Yeah.
He'd hand it to him off the hood. Well, I had taken and put water in his helmet, and when he didn't know it, and they'd put it on the hood, and nobody knew it. And so he took and he's looking at me, and he puts his helmet on, and as he gets his helmet down, he sees me, and I got a big smile on my face, and here comes his helmet, and I catch it in the air, and he said words that I had never heard before, and all that, and I said, "What's the matter?" You know, and he says, "What did you do?" And I said, "Oh, man," I said, "it felt so good to relieve myself, I couldn't stand it." And he had to run the feature with that helmet because he didn't have another one.
Oh, man.
Until the day he died, he never knew that it was water. He always thought it was that I did that. And Donnie Davis was another one before he got killed that was firecrackers and cherry bombs. Al Unser, Bobby Unser, cherry bombs and firecrackers. Al dropped one in the toilet one time and flushed it and broke the toilet and everything else. And he had the Limeys staying with him that worked on Vel Parnelli's car. They come in, and all there is a pipe out of the floor. And, "Hey, mate," he says, "you can't believe what's going on in here." And Bobby, he put a M80 one time in Al's salad, and they called him to the phone. He came back, because there was nobody on the phone. And Bobby timed it just right, and just as Al stuck his fork into it, it blew. And it blew the bowl, it blew the salad over all of us and the people around us and everything else. And I mean, those things happened all the time. But the one that Donnie Davis, that I got him on and I got Carl Williams on, was Donnie. One day in the Speedway, I wore coveralls, and he took a cherry bomb and dropped it in my back pocket. Oh, well, this people are all lined up around the fence watching. Okay, man, I didn't even undo them. I just popped all the buttons off my coveralls and dropped them. And as it blew a big cherry on my rear end, and it burned my underwear, and it blew the pocket off my coveralls and everything else. And I'm standing there trying to get it cooled off, you know, and everything else. And the people are all carrying away. And Donnie, he's just laughing. He's thinking it's really funny. Well, then at Ascot that winter, no, that was Carl. It was at New Bremen. New Bremen. He got killed the next day. So we were at I think it was Eldora, and I walked up to him, and his uniform had a zipper pocket onto it. And I walked up to him, and I took a cherry bomb, but I'd taken everything out of the inside of it, you know, and I lit it, and his pocket wasn't zipped, so I dropped it in there, and then I zipped it.
Oh, well, man.
He like to have a heart attack trying to get the belts undone and get out of his uniform, because he knew this was going to blow up and blow a hole in his heart where it was, you know. And then he realized that it wasn't going to go off, and I said, "Boy, you lucked out," because I said that was a dud, I guess. Because I said it was ready. And I did the same thing to Carl Williams, and he just, I mean, he went out. It was the same thing. He couldn't get out of the car. He couldn't do anything, you know. But I did take but Donnie, he wouldn't take it out of the cherry bomb or the M80. He wouldn't, he'd just drop them in your pocket or whatever, and Johnny Paulson, he dropped one time behind a cop downtown Indianapolis, and the cop went crazy and didn't know what was going on. And then we were next to another one right down the street. We were going to Trenton in the pickup truck, and he went to drop it, and the cop turned around towards us, so he had to bring it back inside the truck. And it went off in his hand.
Oh,
yeah, and it just blew his thumb. His thumb went 2 different directions.
Oh,
blew it
man.
apart. Well, I just taped it up with black tape because we didn't have time to go get it sewed up and all that stuff. Well, it went dead and numb and all that. Well, the way he made a lot of money was he could put that thumb underneath a valve spring tester, and he could go 500, 700 pounds, and he'd never feel it.
Wow.
Well, other guys would do it, and they'd go 100 pounds, and in the one that I remember the best was Finley. He was going to beat John no matter what, and we were all standing there listening, and he goes, I'm going to beat you, I don't care what happens. And he goes a little bit more, and he went a little bit more. We hear, and he crushed his own thumb trying to outdo Paul's. And he never knew that John's thumb was dead. And nobody knew it, but I did, And
one more, and then I got a couple other stuff I want to talk about. Tell me about when you cracked a cylinder head and went out and robbed a cylinder head off Snyder's truck. And had
that was at Terre Haute, and we ran the race with a stock Chevrolet cylinder head
off the tow truck.
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah.
And then put it back and got home.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
That's so awesome.
Yeah.
That is so awesome.
And in Snyder, we had he was driving for me in Oklahoma, and we couldn't get the car to quit oiling because the pistons had been machined too much for the valve pockets, and they were all open. And I Bon Amide it. I put it all over it, to try and seal it up, because that'll bring the rings in right away if they're not in. And it still blew a bunch of oil out of it, but we ran the race and finished it, And he says, What was the deal? Did you think that Bon Amide was going to do something? I said, well, that's what you use to seal rings if you put, get too much oil onto them or something like that. I said, I've done that, on a lot of different motors, Offies and all of them. And he goes, huh. He said, I didn't know that. He said, I couldn't figure out what you were doing. He's with the motor running, putting Bon Amide all over the, down the injectors and all. But
are you 78 years old now?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Tell me what you did for your 75th birthday.
I went to Putnamville and ran my sprint car, and I slipped off the top and hit the wall.
Are you really?
Yeah.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Tell him what you did meanwhile.
Yeah. And I was running. They didn't water the track, and it was really dry. And I was trying to get faster and faster, and it was really slick. And I got against the cushion, and as I was coming off on the back straightaway, I slipped off the cushion, and it went over, and I couldn't get it turned enough, and I got into the wall with it. I thought I broken ribs because my side hurt real bad.
He's not dead yet.
Rosemary's saying you made 75 laps or so, made a bunch of laps.
Yeah.
Tell me about, and this is kind of bringing it up to current, when I first met you, Joey introduced me to you, you had, it's funny because there's guys out there that have Stapp cars that they're calling Poncho's car and this car and that car, and they want to call them famous cars because they are so famous. And when the first times I met you, I was getting into old race cars, and you were kind of giggling and laughing, shaking your head, saying, I got all those cars still. And you did. You had them. And now it's 15, 20 years later, and you've restored those cars. Tell me about the cars you've restored here in the last few years, and what it was like to rebuild the car again with the purpose and the meaning it has now. We're talking legendary race cars.
I liked it a lot better when they were apart in the trailer. The restoring the race cars is not something that I get into. Okay, I want to build it and race it. Mm-hmm. I want what I build to go race and do something with it. In these cars that I did them just like they were and everything else, and they went to Knoxville, and that's what they're good for. Is I am really glad I did it because people can see the cars of the era that we ran.
Yeah, I never got to see those cars run.
Yeah, and they can see them, and people will ask you different things. Well, why is your car this way or that way? They did at Knoxville a lot, and over at the Speedway, I went over there sometimes, and people asked so many questions about them, you know, because they didn't look like any of the other cars. They didn't have inboard brakes, and they didn't have, you know, the stuff that the other cars had, and one of the things, we had Dale Burton at the time, and he lettered the cars, but he did it all with paint. There were no decals. We didn't run decals.
Yeah.
Well, I still don't run decals, and Rick Sander is the painter that does them, and he redid these because Dale had died, and we had the patterns, and he did them, and they look just like Dale had done them.
They're beautiful.
You know, and my feeling on that is that I think they're better than, I mean, really, that not what he did a few changed little things that made it better. I liked it better than I did before, but it was not anything that, you know, that Dale didn't do right. I mean, Dale did a hell of a job on all of the lettering and everything, but I believe that, you know, that a race car, if you're going to take it and you're going to restore it, either you need to go to the old timers and run it where people get to see it, or it needs to be somewhere that people can see it and see the difference in what the years were. And that's what, you know, that's why I did those, is because Buzzy wanted to restore them, and then and that's what he wanted to do. Good. And that's why I did them. But, you know, those cars, you know, it took a lot of time, and I had to find chromers that could chrome them and stuff like that, and I had to do, you know, make some new pieces for them that I didn't, you know, the belly pans were beat off of them, and I had to redo those, and other stuff like that. We had to put a new tail onto it because the bottom of the tail had been broken up, and all the parts on the blue car are the original pieces that ran on that car, except for the cylinder heads on the motor. And the yellow car, the motor is a different motor, but it has the original injectors and the original front drive and magneto and all that stuff on it, and both of them run. And the yellow car, I couldn't find a side bell for the rear end, and I fixed one that was not a Halibrand. It was a Nance, and I redid it and put it on there, but nobody can tell that it isn't. But everything else on them is real. And the yellow car and the blue car are the only two cars that I ever did it to. That's how I know that those were the ones that we won a championship. Is the seats we had were fiberglass. Well, they'd lay out when you got in a corner, and to keep Poncho up straight in a car, all the cars that we ran, the seat hoop had 1.5 inch tilt in it. So he actually was leaning to the left at the start of the race, but he would be straight up and down as it went on. Well, the seats still laid out, so I made, on the seat that we used in both those cars, I made a bracket to go around them that bolted to the seat, and then I made a bracket that went off. That same bracket had 2 brackets that went off of it to a tab that was welded onto the hoop underneath the tail, so that the seat would not give on the right side, you know, when he was in it.
Yeah.
And
that's cool.
Yeah.
It's for a guy like me, I was really happy to see you restore those cars, because I know I'm getting the truth.
Yeah.
You know, guys will restore cars and they'll restore them different, or they'll kind of put their own interpretation into it.
Right.
And to have the guy that originally built them restore them, that's as good as it gets.
The yellow car was restored for Brock Yates, okay, and they put pieces in it that were not into it. And Buzzy bought another car that is painted and everything like that car is, and all that they swore up and down was the real one, and he bought it at Don Smith's auction, and it didn't even have a power steering gear in it. Yeah. And so I looked at
that car too, and I went by your word.
Yeah. And I looked at it, and I looked at a lot of things. Well, Buzzy bought it anyway because he wants me to take and get a steering gear for it and fix it up, and then go to go to Salem and run it a little bit and not run the new one.
That's a good idea.
Not run the ones that have got so much, rebuilding and all that.
Good. Very cool. Good. Man, that's amazing. I cannot thank you enough. It's
I can't thank you.
It's an honor to even know you and to be able to sit down with you. It's just mind blowing, and this is
you're the goofy one that got a hold of me to do this. I really appreciate it because hey, they don't remember old buzzards like me.
Well, the history books do.
Well,
how many? Do you know how many? Let's just go with USAC wins. Do you know how many USAC wins you have?
57.
Wow.
Total. Yeah.
There's guys that spend their whole life to get one.
Yeah.
And that's amazing. That's impressive. 57.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Man.
That counts sprint car and midget and champ car. So
and you're still involved with cars today?
I'm still involved with them. I just have people in my family. I'm not going to mention any names because I want to ride home and not have to walk. That tell me that I'm too old and you can't do it and stuff like that. But and I realize they're right because last week I took and was it last week?
Yep.
Yeah, it was last week. I took. No, it was this week.
Riding an ambulance.
This is this week.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I took Monday and Tuesday, and I did work down at my shop. The same thing I used to do, ran the excavator and did all kinds of things. And when I came home on Tuesday night, I had 12 hours on Monday of working the excavator and doing all this, and I was really tired. And then on Tuesday, I came home and I'd had about 10 and a half hours. When I got home, I didn't know what was the matter because from my feet all the way up into my chest, it was like it had gone to sleep, and I was vibrating. I couldn't figure out what was the matter, and I got worried because I've never had a heart attack and I've never had a stroke, and I didn't know what was going on, and the truck was rocking, and it was really sitting still, and so I called 911 and went, and they figured out that, and I had just had a pacemaker replaced, and the ambulance said that my blood pressure was real high and my pacemaker wasn't working. So I thought, well, they found what it is. Well, when I got to the hospital, none of that was true, but the doctor told me that I have, what is it?
You have neuropathy and you were dehydrated.
I was really badly dehydrated, but I have neuropathy, and I thought the neuropathy was only in your feet or your hands. Well, I found out when I went to the hospital it can be in your whole body when you have overdone everything that you're supposed to do. So, they're right, but you still have to. I still have to prove things to myself.
I know.
It doesn't. Yeah.
You survived getting hit by a train. That's pretty damn impressive. That scared us all, of course, but
he wants to take our retirement money and buy 4 aluminum motors and go run with the World of Outlaws. That's why I'm telling you can't do it anymore.
With Andy and other people, I've run with the World of Outlaws, but I never did a whole season with them, and it would have been something that I would have enjoyed doing during the years, running IMCA back in the day with, Pete Foles and Bobby Grimm and, and all those guys. Those were great years. And when I started out in midgets and all the guys that I ran with, Billy Cantrell, and those guys were all heroes. They were all real, really, race drivers. And
if there's ever been a guy that's been there and done that and has nothing to prove, it's you.
Yeah, but I still got things I got to prove.
You're a racer, I know.
Yeah.
Mr. Stapp, thank you.
Well, I appreciate you having me do this, and you've got to be nuts to have me do it, but it really means a lot to me when you had Joe ask me if I would do it. I would do it anytime with anybody because I love to have people know what it was like, in the years that I did it.
Yeah. And you mentioned Joey. It's worth mentioning. Joey Kerr and I have been buddies since we were 9, and Joey moved up here to work for you and drive for you, and that's kind of how this all comes about. We're sitting in Joey's shop right now. He and Carl Cruzy. I'm going to go interview Carl Cruzy too. I got to get him on here.
Same length of time, just about as Joe.
Yep.
But it just
we were all kids that just wanted to go racing.
Yeah,
and
that's
you
all
helped
he
out.
was. And he just, it's like one of the guys that one of my favorite human beings was the dog. That's Greg Stapp.
Yes, there's a picture of him right over your shoulder. I've been looking at the whole time.
He used to get so mad at me because I would tell him. He said, "Man, I wish I could go racing all the time and do this and that." And I would tell him, "You're not married. You don't." I said, "You don't have any reason to sit down there and babysit the spoons." And I said, "And work for the city of Cincinnati. Go do it. You're not going to get another chance. You got to go do it, or you've wasted the whole time you've been here. You do what you want to do, or you shoot yourself, because you're not doing what you want to do." And he would tell me about how, "Oh man, my mom and dad are on me. I got to work. I've got to make money. I got to do." I said, "Hey, I guess then I'm the lucky one, because my mom and dad never stopped me from anything I wanted to do." I said, when I was 16 years old and came to Indiana with a stranger that had a midget in California, had never been anywhere with him or anything, and we came back and ran Springfield and Blue Island, Illinois, and all these races that we ran, and then he went home and left me here, and I said I went to Milwaukee with Floyd. My dad bought a Ranchero, and I drove back home and stopped for a 4-hour nap at a motel in Tucumcari, New Mexico, and made it home in time to take a shower and be in school on time on Monday. I said, I did what I wanted to do. I still do what I want to do. Now I don't, there's things that I'm doing that I don't want to do, but I'm doing them, but they're going to change. I'm going back to the way it was, and that's just the way that I look at life. There's, if you don't want to do it, don't do it. And
we can only
you're only going to live once.
We can only aspire to be even close to like you, Mr.
Right.
Stapp. Thank you.
You've got to look at one thing that my dad taught me. He said that you're only going to be here one time. He said, unless somebody comes back from where we're going and they can tell you where they went and everything about it and the whole shooting match, we're not coming back. So he says, do her now. And he said, do everything you want to do, see everything you want to see, and go everywhere you want to go, and eat everything you want to eat. And he said, then you can say you did it. But he said, otherwise, he says, it's not going to happen. And Joey, Joey drove for me, and seeing you guys down at Cincinnati. I mean, when we'd go down and run the Berg and that stuff, I mean, it was great times. I mean, it still is.
Yes.
Just seeing you today, and
I'm
being able to do this for you.
Hoping to go over to your shop and take a look around if you got times.
Yeah. So
thank you.
You're welcome.
It doesn't get any better than that.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Anything you want or anytime.
We're going to end it on that.
And thank you very much for asking me.
Thank you. You were passing me notes the whole time to keep things on track, and that helped a ton. Thank you. Thank you.
Are we off?
We're off. That was amazing.
I want you to know one thing.
Thank you.
I didn't tell you that. That's what I'm here. We've been married 55 years, and I'll tell you one thing. I married him for his money. As soon as he gets some, I'm leaving.
You what?
I said, I married you for your money. As soon as you get some, I'm leaving.
Yeah, that's true. She said that all along. Last time she was going to leave, she told me she was leaving, and but she wouldn't leave because the dog would miss me, and
the dog liked him.
The dog's been dead for 10 years.
Yeah.
So she lies.